Welcome to Keen on Science. This is part of my SLOP series, looking at the percentage yield calculations for GCSE chemistry revision. The aim is for you to complete shed loads of practice on percentage yield calculations. Let's dive straight in. Question 1 says copper sulfate may be prepared by the reaction of dilute sulfuric acid on copper oxide. A student prepared 1.6 grams of dry copper sulfate crystals. The theoretical yield is 2.0 grams. Calculate the percentage yield of copper sulfate. So we're going to use the equation percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield, and then we times it by 100 to turn it into a percentage. The first thing we've got to do is identify the actual yield. So the actual yield in this question is 1.6 grams of copper sulfate. We then got to identify the theoretical yield. So from the information, theoretical yield is 2.0 grams. We then calculate the yield. So 1.6 divided by 2, which is the theoretical yield, times by 100 is 80%. Question 2 says sodium carbonate was made in a laboratory experiment. The theoretical yield of the experiment was 15 grams. The actual yield of the experiment was 10.4 grams. Calculate the percentage yield of sodium carbonate. So we're going to use the equation percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield and times by 100 to turn it into a percentage. First thing we're going to do is identify the actual yield. So in this experiment, the actual yield of the experiment was 10.4 grams. We then need to identify the theoretical yield from the information. So in this experiment, 15 grams was the theoretical yield. We put the numbers into the equation to calculate the yield. So 10.4 divided by 15, times it by 100 to turn it into a percentage, and our answer is 69.33%. Question 3 says potassium carbonate was made in a laboratory experiment. The theoretical yield of the experiment was 17 grams. The actual yield of the experiment was 14.5 grams. Calculate the percentage yield of potassium carbonate. So we're going to use the equation percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. First thing we're going to do is identify the actual yield. So from this experiment, the actual yield was 14.5 grams. Secondly, we need to identify the theoretical yield. So in the experiment, theoretical yield is 17 grams. We then calculate the yield by putting the numbers into the equation. So 14.5 divided by 17 times it by 100 to turn it into a percentage, and our yield percentage yield is 85.29%. Question 4 says a company produces 380 kilograms of ethanol. The reaction produces a maximum theoretical mass of 400 kilograms of ethanol from 243 kilograms ethane and 157 kilograms of steam. Calculate the percentage yield of ethanol. So we're going to use the equation percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. First thing we've got to do is identify the actual yield from the information. So the information tells us they make 380 kilograms of ethanol. We've then got to identify the theoretical yield. So from the information, the theoretical yield was 400 kilograms. We can then calculate the yield by putting the numbers into the equation. So 380 divided by 400 times by 100 to turn it to a percentage equals 95%. Question 5. Some underwater welding is done via the thermite reaction, in which rust reacts with aluminium to produce iron and aluminium oxide. In one such reaction, 464 grams of iron was produced. The expected yield was 533. Calculate the percentage yield of iron. So we're going to be using the equation percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. First of all, got to identify the actual yield. So the actual yield in this question was 464 grams of iron. Theoretical yield in the information was 533 kilograms. We then need to calculate the yield. So the yield is 464 divided by 533 times by 100, which equals 87%. Question 6. It says slaked lime is produced when water reacts with quicklime. 2060 grams of slaked lime was produced, the expected yield was 3,171 grams. Calculate percentage yield of slaked lime. So percentage yield is actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. We first need to identify the actual yield. So in this question, the actual yield was 2,060 grams. We then need to identify the theoretical yield from the information, and the theoretical yield is 3,171 grams. Put the numbers into the equation to calculate the yield. So 2,060 divided by 3,171 times it by 100 to turn it into a percentage. That equals 65% yield. Question 7 says 60 kilograms of aluminium oxide produces a maximum of 31.8 kilograms of aluminium. In an extraction process, only 28.4 kilograms of aluminium is produced from 60 kilograms of aluminium oxide. Calculate the percentage yield of aluminium. So we know percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. The first thing we need to do is identify the actual yield from the information. So the actual yield is 28.4 kilograms. We then need to identify the theoretical yield. The theoretical yield is 31.8 kilograms. We put the numbers into the equation to calculate the yield. So 28.4 divided by 31.8 times by 100 equals 89.3% as a percentage yield. And 8. A reaction between iron oxide and hydrogen produces 0.745 grams of H2O. The theoretical yield of the experiment was 0.95 grams. Calculate the percentage yield of water. So we're going to use the equation percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. We're going to first identify the actual yield. So the actual yield in this equation is 0.745 grams. The theoretical yield is 0.95 grams. We put the numbers in the equation to calculate the yield. So 0.745 divided by 0.95 times by 100 equals 78.42% as a percentage yield. Question 9. The reaction of CaCN2 with H2O produces 27.1 grams of NH3. The theoretical yield was 30.4 grams. Calculate the percentage yield of NH3. So we're going to use the equation percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. First of all, we're going to identify the actual yield. Well, from this information, producers is 27.1 grams of ammonia. We're going to identify the theoretical yield. So in this information, the theoretical yield is 30.4 grams. We're going to put the numbers into the equation to calculate the yield. 27.1 divided by 30.4 times by 100 equals 89.14% as a percentage yield. Question 10. The reaction of N2 with H2 produces 10.5 grams of NH3. The theoretical yield was 18.2 grams. Calculate the percentage yield of NH3. So the percentage yield is actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. First of all, we've got to identify the actual yield. So the actual yield was 10.45 grams. The theoretical yield is 18.2 grams. We then calculate the yield by using the equation. Put the numbers into the equation, we get 10.5 divided by 18.2 times 100, which equals 57.7% as a percentage yield. Question 11. The reaction of HCl with BaOH2 produces 35 grams of BaCl2. The theoretical yield was 42 grams. Calculate the percentage yield of BaCl2. So we're using the equation percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. We identify the actual yield, which is 35 grams. The theoretical yield in the question is 42 grams. We calculate the yield by putting these numbers into the equation. So 35 divided by 42 times by 100 equals 83.33% as a percentage yield. Question 12. The reaction of N2 with H2 produces 10.5 grams of NH3. The theoretical yield was 18.2. calculate the percentage yield of NH3. So we're going to use the equation, percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. So we're going to identify the actual yield first of all. That was 10.5 grams. The theoretical yield is 18.2. We then calculate the yield by putting the numbers into the equation. So 10.5 divided by 18.2 times 100 is 57.7%. Question 13. The reaction produces a maximum theoretical mass of 257 grams of ethanol from ethene and steam. 200 grams of ethanol was produced in the lab. Calculate percentage yield of ethanol. So percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. So the first we want to identify is the actual yield. So from the information, we made 200 grams. We then want to work out the theoretical yield. So the theoretical yield in the lab was 257 grams. We then calculate the yield by putting those numbers into the equation. So 200 divided by 257 times by 100 equals a percentage yield of 77.8. Question 14. Some underwater welding is done via the thermite reaction, in which rust reacts with aluminium to produce iron and aluminium oxide. In one such reaction produces 500 grams of iron. The expected yield was 533. So the percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. So I want to identify the actual yield. So that was 500 grams in this question. The theoretical yield was 533 grams. We then calculate the yield. So 500 divided by 533 times by 100 equals the percentage yield of 93.8. Question 15. Slate lime is produced when water reacts with quicklime. 26 grams of slate lime was produced. The expected yield was 31 grams. Calculate the percentage yield of slate lime. So we use the equation, percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. We first want to identify the actual yield, so that's 26 grams. We then identify the theoretical yield, which is 31 grams. We put those numbers into the equation, so 26 divided by 31 times by 100 equals 83.87% as a percentage yield. Question 16. Copper sulfate may be prepared by the reaction of dilute sulfuric acid on copper oxide. A student prepared 5 grams of dry copper sulfate crystals. The theoretical yield was 7.6. Calculate the percentage yield of copper sulfate. So we use the equation, percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. We identify the actual yield, so from this question that's 5 grams. We then identify the theoretical yield, so that's 7.6 grams from the information. We then calculate the yield by putting the numbers into the equation. So 5 divided by 7.6 times by 100 equals a percentage yield of 65.79. Question 17. The reaction of sodium hydroxide with sulfuric acid produces 13.5 grams of sodium sulfate. The theoretical yield was 19.2 grams. Calculate the percentage yield of sodium sulfate. So percentage yield equals actual yield divided by theoretical yield times by 100. So we identify the actual yield. So from the question, that was 13.5 grams. The theoretical yield was 19.2 grams. So then we can calculate the yield. So that's 13.5 divided by 19.2 times by 100 equals 70.3% as a percentage yield. I hope you found these questions useful. Please subscribe and I'll see you next time.